Hi, my name is Laura Banks, and this is my discussion for reading number 3. The first book we were asked to read was Teaching the Taboo, and we read chapter 5, 6, and 7. So chapter 5, Banned, Suppressed, Bound, and Gagged. I think the underlying was just talking about authority, and that in schools we tend to teach authority. Don't question, don't mess with the power. This chapter talked about an example of an underground magazine that the kids were writing, and when the school got wind of it, they didn't look at the teacher that the students had said was looking down shirts. Instead, they punished the students for writing it. And for me, that kind of affected me because I think our students should have a voice. We're trying to teach them to stand up for themselves and to think for themselves, and if we're telling them what to think and what to say, we're kind of taking that away from them. I know specifically in my classroom, I'm really big on not having an authoritative classroom. I want my kids to feel comfortable where they are, at the same time teaching them to respect. I think a lot of times we have this issue of not being able to teach respect for authority without being extremely authoritative, and I think that it's a very important thing that teachers need to be able to do, to be able to teach students to respect their bosses, respect teachers, respect that authority idea, but not drill them with it. And then that kind of goes into chapter 6, Queer the Common Sense. This one a lot about teaching students to question them, and it kind of rolled into chapter 5 for me when I was reading it. Because it kind of talked about the fact that we need to teach our students the truth and understand that they can take it in a sense. We tend to sugarcoat everything, and we need to teach them what's actually happening because they need to be able to question the content. They need to be able to ask questions and formulate their own opinions, and I feel like that's what those 2 chapters were really generally about. So moving on from that into chapter 7, we talked about teaching lives. And the big question of this chapter was simply why be a teacher? And it kind of touched on the fact that teachers are always take the downfall. We're the ones to blame with the educational system, with things going on in the classroom, student not doing well. It's our fault. And so we kind of need to understand that why are we a teacher? And kind of teach from the heart, want to be a teacher in order to make all of this worth it. One thing that really stood out to me that kind of was mentioned, it talked about modeling for students being, in a sense, a growing person. I know for me, I make a ton of mistakes when I'm teaching. I'm awful at spelling. I teach science, and my spelling is horrible. I can spell the chemical compound names, but spelling things like I mess up. And my kids point it out to me all the time, and I'm more than happy to tell them, hey, if I make a mistake, just let me know. I'm still learning too. And I think it's really important that we have that connection with our kids. And I think that these 3 chapters kind of tied into that of being human with our kids and letting them understand that they're human as well and we're growing together. The next one we were asked to read was Effective Classroom Management. So this one we did chapter 6 and chapter 7. So let me flip to my notes from that. So for chapter 6, we have implementing and managing engaging instruction. So it kind of talked about during the lesson what you need to do before the lesson, during the lesson, and after the lesson. So I'm just going to give you a quick preview and kind of what that looks like in my classroom. So before a lesson, the first thing that you need to look at is physical design. I know I've had lessons where I did it the first time and I thought my classroom would be big enough. We moved all the desks out and we were doing a walk-around activity, and I realized during my first class, oh my gosh, we do not fit in here. So my next period, I had to take them outside to do this activity, and it worked so much better. They were so much more on task, simply just because the classroom wasn't enough room. So just keeping that physical design of your classroom, of how many students, all of that. Oh, well, we'll get to the number of students. So physical design, just what my classroom looks like. Do we need to move to a different class? Do we need computers to go to the computer lab? What do I need? Materials is the next one. The biggest thing I got out of this is distribution and collecting of materials. So first of all, you need to make sure that you have all the materials. It's really bad if you're middle of a lesson and oh, just kidding, I don't have this. We can't continue this lesson. That looks really bad on the teacher just because it shows that you weren't prepared for what you were doing. And it's your job. You need to come prepared. But the next thing is You can have a lesson and distributing materials, you're running all over the classroom, everyone's getting up to go grab things, and it's chaos. A lot of the time I do cooperative learning groups, so I'll say, okay, number 2s, can you guys all go to the back? I need you to get this, this, and this, and it'll be up on the board exactly what they're supposed to get. Number 3s on the other side of the classroom, you're grabbing this while they're doing that. Number 4, take out a pen and pencil. So just making sure you have some sort of organization to distribute the materials. And then the next thing is collecting them. So like, okay, well, since 2's got all that, they're going to go put them back the way they found them. And then I normally stop 5 minutes before, have everyone put everything back, and then I do a walk of the classroom before I let anyone leave class. Next thing is number of students. You need to know how many students you're going to have. Remember, we're going to have some absent, we're going to have some present. So again, with cooperative learning groups, this works really well. Generally, we're in groups of 4. I plan my lessons around groups of 4. It's really easy then. If a number is missing, then the group just shares that number. If one person's only in the group, I'll just move them. But in general, it works really well. You tend to not have too many people in the same group missing. And then the last thing is group number, and I just talked about that. In my group, I use collaborative learning groups, so I design my lessons around that. But if you don't, maybe you only have 20 kids and you want to break them up into smaller pairs or groups of 3, that's fine too. The next thing was during the lesson. So the first thing they talked about was making it relevant. I think that's important. We know that relevance, if you increase the relevance in their lives, they're going to be more motivated to work on it. The next one's clear instruction. Super important, making sure that they know exactly what's expected of them. If they get confused, they tend to not do what they're supposed to be doing because they're over it. They don't understand it. They don't want to do it anymore. Next thing is teaching them how to work in groups. So again, with the cooperative learning groups, it's really easy. We go through making sure step by step they learn how to work together. But again, even if you didn't, you can teach them specific ways to work with other people. Next thing is transitions. Again, I practice transitions in my classroom. Like, okay, if we're in groups and we need to split up, this should only take 30 seconds. We're going to practice it a couple times until it's perfect, and then they'll do it. And generally it takes 1 or 2 times and they're not off task anymore. Feedback, you need to be sure you're monitoring their progress and giving them feedback while they're doing it, because then they're more motivated. Like, oh, she saw it. She thought this was really good, but she said that this needed work, and they can go back and correct that themselves. And the last one is just monitoring behavior, which ties right into the next chapter. So chapter 17 was addressing discipline issues. So first they talked about the 4 key behaviors for the teacher that are really good for effective classroom management. And the first one was with itness, so like being with it. And that's just monitoring behavior. You need to know exactly what's going on every corner of your classroom. So even if you're working with one student, making sure you can still see the rest of the class, because while you're working with that one student, kid in the corner doesn't think you can see them as they're lighting their hair on fire. So you just need to be able to see the entire classroom. No matter if you're focusing on one student, you still need to be watching with the eyes in the back of your head, per se. The next one is overlapping, and that's just the ability to multitask. I know for me, I have people coming in the classroom constantly, either pulling kids out, kids coming in late. And as a teacher, you need to be able to understand that I can still be teaching and dealing with this at the same time. The next one was signal continuity and momentum, and that's just making sure your lessons are well-paced, you're not moving too fast or too slow, because if you're moving too fast, kids tune out. If you're moving too slow, they're bored. You've got to make sure that your pacing is correct to keep them interested in what you're doing. The next one is variety and challenge within lessons. So you've got to make sure that they're not doing the same thing every day because it's boring. They need to have variety. They need to be challenged by what they're doing in order for them to actually be engaged in what's going on. So next up, it started talking about responding to behavior problems. So it talked about minor and major, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But it had a guide, like the 3 main things to do for responding to behavior. So the first one was keeping the dignity of the student. Don't embarrass them, because then they're going to be angry at you and they're going to act out more. You need to make sure that the way you handle it is respectful of the student. You expect them to respect you by correcting their behavior. You need to be respectful of them in getting them to do that. The next thing is keep the instruction program going. So don't stop teaching because of this student. You need to be able to figure out a way to keep instruction going. So a lot of the time for me, I do discussion points. So I'll wait till a discussion point or I'll send them a little bit early to a discussion point so I can walk over to the student and be like, hey, like, this is not acceptable behavior. This is what I need you to be doing. That way it's not distracting from the whole class. The whole class isn't focused on that one student. They're doing something else in the process where they're still learning and you're keeping them engaged. And then the last thing was culturally consistent language. You need to understand that different cultures respond differently to different things. Whereas like a student in their household, the way they speak to you might not be rude, but you feel it's rude because of the way you were raised, because we have different cultures and different backgrounds. So just understanding where the student is coming from and not being angry at them for things that are culturally, and finding positive ways to redirect them. Last thing that it talked about was the response. So for minor, generally nonverbal cues can be used. So I know my kids know my look. They tell me all the time that I have a look where they know when somebody's misbehaving because I'll just look at the student. And generally that works. They're like, oh, shoot, she caught me. It talked about a few other ways. That one's the one that works best for me. But one of the other things that I really liked was it talked about good behavior and praise. So instead of just giving that student a look, maybe somebody who's on task be like, oh my gosh, thank you so much for doing what you're doing. Then the other kids are like, hey, why is he getting praise and I'm not? And they might be more willing to get back on task. Again, these are just for minor disturbances. I also do a warning system in my classroom where like I'll just look at a student and hold up a 1, and that's your first warning. They only get 2 warnings. And then I have a logical consequence sequence. So like you get your first warning. Second warning, you get a 15-minute detention with me during lunch. If you get a third warning within the same, you'll get a note sent to your advisor and they'll call you in to talk to them. If it's beyond that, you'll be sent to your advisor. So they have their logical consequences. And that's actually what we were going to talk about for major issues, is to have logical consequences. Like they know and tend to have like a system or like a hierarchy of what the consequences are for different behaviors. And those need to be like completely shown to them so they know what they're getting themselves into. Last one that we talked about was what should I do? And this chapter was what have my students learned and how will I know? And it was a big thing about assessment, which tied in well to us doing our alternative assessment. Simply because, again, it talked about the problems that you may have, especially in low-income schools, where you're going to have more language barriers, students who might not speak English, and so you're giving them a test that's in English, and is that really testing what they actually know? Because they can't write down what they're saying. Also, another thing about like bad testers, I put that in quotes because, again, we might think we're a bad tester just simply because maybe I don't like reading and having to read all those multiple choice questions. I don't like it. Or I get really bad test anxiety. There's different ways that you can be a quote unquote bad tester. So it just talked about like, what do you do? And my biggest thing after reading the scenarios is like, you have to know your students really well to understand what's going to work for them and how you're going to assess them, because each class is going to be different. Even within the same year, you could have one class that's very good at taking handwritten essays and another class who they hate writing. They want to do something with their hands, and you just need to know your classes and know your students to be able to decide how you can best know how they're going to show you what they've learned. So that's my discussion on reading number 3. That's it.